The scope of this series is to introduce students and the community at large to a broad range of interdisciplinary practitioners, including artists, educators, and filmmakers. And the lectures are open to the public and are presented virtually in conjunction with classroom and studio disciplines here at Cal State Fullerton. Now, I just want to remind everyone that this program is being recorded and it will be made available on our website. And to get updated information as to when these recordings are available, be sure to follow us via Instagram at Begovich Gallery for the announcements. And during the course of the program, be sure to post your questions in the chat box below your screen, and we will conclude our program with a Q&A session led by Professor Pomonas following today's presentation. So now for our main event. We are honored and delighted to have with us today artist Sandy Rodriguez. And before we open the virtual forum to Sandy, here's a brief introduction. Sandy Rodriguez is a Los Angeles-based painter. She was raised in San Diego, Tijuana, and Los Angeles and earned her BFA from CalArts. Her work investigates the methods and materials of painting across cultures and histories. An example of this is her work entitled Codex Rodriguez Mondragon, which is made up of a collection of maps and paintings about the intersections of history, social memory, contemporary politics, and cultural production. She has exhibited at art venues such as Art and Practice in Los Angeles, the Riverside Art Museum in Riverside, and we were just talking about this Charlie James Gallery in Los Angeles, to name a few. Most recently, she has been awarded the Caltech Huntington Art and Research Residency. And I want to also just add, on behalf of Cal State Fullerton, we want to congratulate Sandy for being named as one of the recipients for the 2021 Creative Capital Award. So please join me in welcoming Sandy Rodriguez.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and I'm so delighted to see you all here today. Before I begin with my presentation, I just wanted to mention that I did, prior to making artwork full-time, have a 20-year career in art education, in museum education, and working across audiences. Basically, over the 20 years, I was creating curriculum, doing professional development, working across audiences, across what I call the Greater Los Angeles Museum. 4 years ago, I had the opportunity to really shift and make artwork full-time and teach in my spare time. And education is something that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm constantly thinking about ways to engage with a variety of audiences. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and launch into my presentation and share with you some unpublished work to begin with, and then just kind of go backwards. So what you are looking at is a brand new work in progress. So as you heard, the Codex Rodriguez Mondragon is my current series, and it is a collection of maps and specimen paintings about the intersections of history, social memory, contemporary politics, and cultural production. It incorporates those hand-processed colorants, mineral pigments, onto a sacred ceremonial, once outlawed paper called amate, reclaiming and reaffirming the indigenous artistic practices of the Americas. The use of plant materials in the production of the work, as well as in the work, depicted in the work, is significant not only for situating the object within specific floristic provinces, but also for their medicinal and utilitarian use on top of their healing properties. This makes my maps not only a representation of place, but the objects that serve as an active embodiment of its constituent parts. In my work, a multitude of records and documents and maps are combined and juxtaposed to really inform an interpretation of space, where all of this is recovered, re-envisioned, and painted as a codex, a macro and micro view of humanity in relationship to time, power, and land. The object that you're looking at here is titled You Are Here, Tovangar, El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Porciúncula, Los Angeles. This is dedicated to a dear friend and colleague, Tongva elder Julia Bogany, rest in power, who passed just a few weeks ago. This is a hand-processed watercolor and will ultimately have 24 karat gold on a 97 by 97 inch double map of Amate. So this is a map of Los Angeles that makes visible the movements of people that have and continue to call this place home over time. It's an evocative representation of the topography, language, and land use. Similar to the ways that audiences approach wayfinding maps, viewers will encounter You Are Here in the Virginia Steele Scott Galleries of American Art at the Huntington Museum this fall. After passing through a selection of native plants that will be curated for their medicinal and utilitarian properties of colorants from the Americas, inviting viewers to pause, look, locate destinations, personal histories in a monumental multilingual map of our city. Included are native plants, animals, a sacred oak, as a cosmic tree with the cardinal directions, intermingled with references of uprisings amid past epidemics in Los Angeles, under a rainbow presenting a view of our past, present, and history. You Are Here is firmly rooted in the research about Los Angeles, its communities, history maps, primary documents, while leveraging diverse intergenerational relationships to scholars, historians, including, as I mentioned, the late Tongva elder Julia Bagani. My investigation into Indigenous color use in the Americas led me to research the Florentine Codex, and what you're looking at is a sheet of, or a couple of pages from Book 11, which tells of all the medicinal plants. The Florentine Codex is essentially a 12-volume encyclopedia of over 2,000 pages with over 2,000 images, and it's written in Nahuatl on one column and Spanish in the other column. It was compiled by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún and 22 indigenous writers and artists known as Tlacuilos during the middle of the 16th century, where they created this compendium of all things of New Spain. It is important to mention that this is created under a colonial regime at a time when the world was radically changing, and created in part under a quarantine of a pandemic that wiped out 90% of the population. What you're looking at here is my desk in Joshua Tree Highlands. Last year, I was awarded the Alma Reese inaugural fellowship for Latinx artists at the Joshua Tree JTHAR Highlands Artist Residency. And the first thing that I do when I get out to a site, and this is where I am again, I've been here for 2 months and I'm wrapping up production on 8 exhibitions here. I go through and I basically do a survey of the property, see who's flowering, start beginning to do research about the medicinal and edible plants in the area, and then begin to process the colors by hand, whether it's a heat extraction on plant-based color or whether it is processing pigments that I have procured prior to arriving. Oops. One of the things that I was able to do this year was to go out and procure ochre with the assistance of a friend, Devlin Gandy, and so here he shot a picture of me collecting ochre up in the Cespi, which is near Lompoc. And then you see this prismatic collection of minerals at my feet here that I thought would be really interesting to share with you. As you heard in my bio, I recently was awarded the Art and Research Fellowship with Caltech and the Huntington, where I was able to process these colors with my students every week and learn about their significance in terms of use over time, from the original inhabitants and caretakers of the region all the way through contemporary practice. And what you're looking at is a small little handful of ochre that is then crushed in a mortar pestle until it is a very fine powder. And then you basically do some levigation on it, which is a separating of the larger particles to the smaller particles, and then you grind it together with your binder. So you have kind of a snapshot in one slide of what my students and I were doing over 10 weeks as part of my fellowship, where I was teaching a course with science and engineering students. This is my desk at home, where you have a sense of not only the mineral-based pigments, but also organic-based pigments that you'll see, and a number of tools that I use as part of the production. On the right-hand side, you have a color chart. Every time I process a color, I have to write down the recipe. I have to write down the pH level of the water, the amount, the ratios of binder versus colorant, and make sure that I am logging how I produced each color. The color strip on the bottom of the chart on the right is actually a single colorant, but you can shift these single colorants with the addition and creating more acidic or more pH neutral water when you're processing. These are two examples of the botanicals that you will see as part of this series. And if any of you had an opportunity to see the 2019 Cola exhibition at the Municipal Art Gallery, you would have seen these particular folios. One is for the oak and one is for toyon. One of the things that is critical to my research is understanding plant knowledge over time and researching the language in which these plants are addressed and or referred to. So you'll find Tongva, you'll find Latin, you'll find English, you'll find Spanish on these botanicals to again point to plant knowledge over time. The first map of the series is Mapa de la Región Fronteriza de Alta y Baja Califas. And this particular map was the very first created in 2017 for a Pacific Standard Time exhibition. And really, I had an opportunity in 2016 to, as I said, make that transition out of museum education work. And I was the education specialist for K-12 audiences. So I was doing a lot of curriculum and a lot of professional development programs within the context of a museum. And at this moment, I had an opportunity to do the research that I needed to do for my practice full time, as well as create an education program inside of a hospital in Willowbrook called Martin Luther King Community Hospital. We created a drop-in program for unhomed residents, unhomed Angelenos that were coming out of ICU that needed rehabilitation in terms of physical therapy and continuing kind of getting themselves back on their feet. So I would go out once a month on floristic field study, botany explorations through the deserts of California with an herbalist. Each particular landscape has an indicator plant, medicinal plants that are also used for colorants, simultaneously with my research in the colonial processing of color according to the Florentine Codex. So you'll see here the initial blow up of an image where I've taken out the male painter scribe and I've included myself as the Tlacuilo processing the cochinilla, which is a scale insect that feeds on the flesh of the opuntia or paddle-tail cactus. Just earlier today, I was taking a hike through Joshua Tree and I saw the white webby covering that the cochinilla create for themselves while feeding on the cactus. It is the female insect that creates carminic acid that makes that red within her body. It is then dried and processed and then used for paint. This color changed the international art markets from the 16th to 18th century and is one of the most potent and stunning natural organic colors and is used widely. The second map of the series is de los señales pronósticos and ice raids in Califas. Whereas in the first map, there were small indicator razor wire rings for all of the sites of immigration detention centers. In 2018, California was being punished for being a sanctuary state by the federal government, and they began doing immigrations customs enforcement raids on various businesses. They were targeting businesses like Northgate, where they knew that they would have a very high concentration of immigrant and migrant employees, as well as places like 7-Elevens. And so on the right-hand column, instead of color processing, what you're seeing are images of resistance, images of the capture of residents, images of omens, going back to the Florentine Codex and thinking about these cycles of violence towards brown bodies. Here you'll find the historic image on the left, which basically has the arrival of the Spaniards and the war and the conquest of Mexico. And then on the right-hand side, you see where I've pulled out the aerial and marine vehicles that are used to pursue residents in California to capture them. What you're looking at here is a very large Dyer's polypore mushroom that I collected on a field study in Northern California. And these particular mushrooms produce the most brilliant yellow. And I had been searching for a brilliant yellow to paint the Golden State color. And it was in Northern California where I procured this particular mushroom. So what happens is I will collect this particular mushroom, and this mushroom is known by the Forestry Service as butt rot, as it robs the conifers or cone-bearing trees of their nutrients. And so this thing is as wide as your chest, and in the lower left-hand portion, you can see a figure holding this thing. So trying to carry that up in a Trader Joe's bag on a very steep incline with like knee-high galoshes through leaf litter was quite challenging. And then the bag got soaking wet and it ripped. But I finally got this up into my trunk, drove 9 hours south, painted its portrait, processed it by breaking off the margins and then putting it in a dehydrator. Later, you can extract the color very, very easily with boiling water at a boil and then reduce to a simmer. The next map of the series is MAPA, the Child Detention Center's Family Separations and Other Atrocities. In this particular map, as in all of the maps, where I've done field study in the Western United States in the territory that once belonged to Mexico prior to 1848, you will find that I include landscapes for each place where I laid my head and I spent a sustained amount of time. So about a week or 2 weeks within each particular region, again, learning about the edible and medicinal and utilitarian plants. Oops. In the portion that is near El Paso, you see the Tornillo tent city, as well as child migrants sleeping on the floor under emergency blankets, juxtaposed with the images of weeping women from the colonial text that we mentioned before. This is what my gear looks like when I pack up 100 pounds of camping, painting gear, jump on an Amtrak, and get out to New Mexico. I had a friend pick me up there, and then it was at that point that I met up with my herbalist friend and enrolled in a few classes and did a lot of intersession field study. So I cut these small sheets of amate paper and I bring them out with me to the field. And so it's slow collecting and note taking about the endemic plants that grow in that region and nowhere else in the world. Here you'll see me on a trail in Montezuma, New Mexico. And it was on this trail that I found a feather and a fish on the trail, which was a very curious thing that left me with many, many questions. Upon returning to Los Angeles, I took a picture of the feather, forwarded it to some colleagues at the Natural History Museum where I had been in residence for that summer to get a proper ID. Every single element in these maps is thoroughly researched and thoroughly cross-referenced. Once I realized that it was the feather of a great horned owl, and the staff member at the Natural History Museum was very specific about it being the lower left wing, like fifth feather from the bottom, I was able to then go back into the Florentine Codex, research what the kind of lore around the great horned owl is in Mexico. We hear different narratives and stories and mythologies about the significance of owls within the Southwest. And so once that was fully fleshed out in my mind, I was able to prepare it as a pen. So it takes basically soaking the feather in water overnight, heating sand to 275 degrees, curing the tip, cutting and preparing your pen. But then you have a one-of-a-kind mark-making tool for creating the map of this particular area. This is a close-up view of a western antler lichen that I collected from the ground in New Mexico. Lichen has a very important and interesting history. that we won't get into today, but you can certainly look into it. It is not a fungus, it is not a plant, it is a living organism into itself. It smells like heaven when it is simmered. And then I processed it according to a very detailed recipe that takes 21 days of agitating it and fermenting it. After 21 days of preparing this pigment, I did learn that it only works on proteins, fur, feathers, or silk, and not on cellulose, which is what the bark paper that I use is made from. So sometimes you do a lot of work and then realize it's for something else. One of the more recent maps that you might have seen last year is called "You Will Not Be Forgotten: Mapa for the Children Who Were Killed in Customs or in Custody of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, 2018 to 2019." Each map takes 6 to 9 months to create because there is such tremendous amounts of research, translation, archival investigation, testing. And the way that you work on a mate is that you have one opportunity to deposit the color and really paint out that area because you cannot blend. It is an unsized paper. It is an external bark paper. I included the sites where the children took their last breath, as well as the landscapes where I did field study. In this particular scene, all the way to the right, you're seeing a film still from the ProPublica video that was released around the death of Goyito. And next to him, you'll see the images of the crying fathers, much like you saw the images of the crying mothers in the past. There's also a landscape of El Paso, some Ephedra nevadensis, which is Mormon tea used for respiratory illness, which is what ended up killing a number of the children. The owl, again, is the omen of death. A number of other medicinal and edible plants that are indicative of that floristic province. Here you have two images. One is of another codex that I have been researching for the past few years, and it is a materia medica that is created at the same time as the Florentine in the same college by this first generation of mestizo or bicultural scholars that are integrating both the European traditions of manuscript as well as the base of knowledge of the Nahua culture. So in this materia medica, they do have a plant that is called nonochton that is used for pain of the heart. So in the image that you see on the right, which will be on view in New York this summer, you have a double portrait of Mari and her mother Yasmin on the front of this loving portrait of a mother and her child next to the plant for pain of the heart. Here you have healer number 1 and healer number 2. Healer number 1 is providing the treatment for a viral infection of the upper respiratory. This is currently on view at El Museo in New York, as well as healer number 3 for comforting the enfermos, which is a play on an image of a healer helping the ill during a pandemic. But you have the nonochton in the lower portion of this particular composition. And the maps are 97 inches tall by 47 inches wide, and these are 31 inches wide by 47 tall, just to give you a sense of scale. Contained in that manuscript that we were just talking about, there is a recipe for susto, or trauma. And so it took me many months of working with a variety of scholars to get some new translations on a 16th century paragraph that describes this recipe. Mind you, this recipe is created by a Nahua doctor who survived not only the pandemic, but survived the conquest. And so imagine 90% of the population being wiped out, the kind of PTSD that the surviving population would have symptoms for. So susto is like a trauma. And so it took me quite a few months, as I mentioned, to really investigate and figure out which were those plants because they only had the Nahuatl name. They didn't have the Latin binomial or a Spanish equivalent. So I had to do a lot of different kind of strategies for digging. You're also noticing there is a sphinx moth that is one of the pollinators. And these are like 5-inch beautiful moths with these very, very beautiful details on them. Donatui, which is on the right, is also used in the potion for treating susto, but it's also used for government officials that are experiencing fatigue in extreme time periods. I wanted to just share with you that I have about 8 exhibitions coming up, and we're looking at solo and 2-person shows opening in December at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in December, at the LA County Museum of Art for an exhibition called Mixpantli Contemporary Echoes opening in December, at the A&D Museum at UCSB entitled Amid a Pandemic that will include a full catalog with 5 scholarly contributions and essays. And the group museum exhibitions, as I shared with you earlier, include the Huntington Museum for a new framing of the American art galleries in an installation called Borderlands. So in that particular exhibition, I spent quite a bit of time doing research as part of the Caltech Huntington Art and Research Fellowship, but now it is expanded into producing the actual object, as well as advising on interpretive gallery material for a space that we're calling Art and Ecology, and really thinking about addressing intergenerational audiences in informal spaces. The exhibition that is currently on view is El Museo Estamos Bien, La Triennale 2020 to 2021. There will be 2 exhibitions at the Denver Art Museum. One is called Revisión, Art in the Americas, that juxtaposes the historic collection with the contemporary, as well as a new exhibition that is opening in Denver in February about Malinche that will then be traveling to Albuquerque and San Antonio. Also in the fall, you have an opportunity to check out the JTHAR Anniversary Exhibition, which is the Joshua Tree Highlands Artist Residency, that will be showcasing 15 years of artist in residence works curated by Alma Ruiz at the San Bernardino County Museum. I am super excited to have an opportunity to chat about anything that you have questions about. We have plenty of time for Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and stop there.
Thank you so much, Sandy. The students have been writing their questions in the chat, but if anybody wants to jump in and raise their hand or just start speaking, you're more than welcome to do that. I know that usually they're a little shy to talk out loud, so I'm going to go ahead and read. I'm going to start with the first question, which is Joyce Lim. Did your experience as a museum educator influence your teaching methods in classroom settings? She actually has 3 questions here. And then the second part is, how do factors such as shorter time limits, constant new visitors, students, and visual aids or activities for each exhibit impact engagement with the topics in the museum? So very complicated question, but it's really interesting.
We'll start with the first one, and then I'll probably have you repeat the second one again.
Sure.
So the first question again was, how did my museum education practice inform my artistic practice?
Yes.
In museum education, you have an opportunity to really provide as many entry points as possible for audiences to engage with an object and make meaning. You have an opportunity to build community within a variety of stakeholders. Those could be intergenerational, those could be a single age group, those could be as variable as there are audiences. So giving deep thought to how people make meaning and how people engage with objects is absolutely at the forefront of my mind. So the research, the intentionality, and the clarity of your goals with an object is certainly part of my process when I'm creating a work of art.
Awesome. And I think the second half of that question is about when you're at the museum and you're teaching, how does it work? How do you become flexible as a teacher, and what are the sort of limitations of working that way? Because she's talking about the constant new groups of kids and the flexibility of the classroom situation in the museum.
So I'll tell you, within museums or any of these spaces, teaching with science students, teaching with doctors and therapists in a hospital, teaching at a natural history museum, teaching at a research university, it all, again, really provides you with those opportunities to think and see the work with new eyes. When you know that you do not have the luxury of a sequential building towards hitting your goals and objectives, your teaching shifts. And it's about being very realistic, about creating an opportunity and space for dialogue, as well as making meaning with the object where your intention is your intention, and that's great. I'll put down every bit that I have, but you'll pick up everything that you bring to it. So meaning is made when you, the viewer, come to the object. When I was teaching with Martin Luther King Community Hospital, it was 10 weeks. It was 3 hours a week. People would pop in and out. They wouldn't even have the opportunity to stay for the full 2 hours. The hospital director would come by. I've got 5 minutes. What's the featured colorant? Where are are there any readings you can send me? I can't watch the demo. You know, other people stayed for 2 hours and they came back each time. So there is a flexibility that as you teach, you just adapt. But really being crystal clear about what your goals and your takeaways are going to be allows you to do that assessment at the end.
Awesome. And this is from Julissa Ponce. What process do you use to get pigments from insects, and what type of insects? Well, you talked a little bit about the cochineal bug. And then what specific ingredients do you like to use to create pigments? Do you have a favorite natural ingredient?
So there's only one insect that is used in my studio production, and that is the cochinilla, which is the scale insect that we talked about earlier. And that is processed through grinding the dried insect in a mortar pestle. You can prepare it in a number of ways. I recommend that you just kind of Google some of the videos on how to extract color from it. But essentially, once you have extracted a colorant, you have an opportunity to stick it together and make paint. If you're making medieval manuscript paint, you're going to use egg glare, which is the kind of meringue of a frothed egg white, or the yolk if you want it more a warmer color. If you're creating watercolor, you'll use gum arabic. If you're creating oil paint, you'll use linseed oil, so on and so forth. But typically when you're doing a lake or a dye, there are a few more steps, and there are a number of wonderful handbooks for artists that really outline kind of this procedure. So definitely, if you're curious, I would certainly look up a couple of videos.
This is a question from Marina Avalos. What is your favorite part about the journey you have taken thus far? That's a broad question, really interesting though.
I think one of my favorite parts is really having an opportunity to share the research about the work and to hear so many different responses and so many different ways in which different types of learners engage with the work and make meaning, and how those really kind of impact the conversation and the dialogue. So it's about having the opportunity to teach and to share that work. I should also mention that part of my practice, I work with a group of about 10 poets. And as you heard me talk about Julia earlier, she was one of the members of that group. But these 10 scholars and poets convene in my studio once a quarter because I love teaching. That is in my blood. I love painting. And so I create prompts with some of my poets, and we'll process color together. We'll do a deep reading of a historic source. Some of my scholars will facilitate that conversation. Then we'll do a series of writing prompts. Then we'll do a reading for each other. Then we'll edit those. And then once in the exhibition, we'll have an opportunity to really activate the work and perform the work. The work on Amate ends up becoming a prompt for these tales to be told, these poems to be recited, for music to be introduced into the gallery, which appeals and really engages a number of generations within an exhibition space and prompts action, right? When the content is so loaded with politics and material and voice and music, there is an opportunity to really inspire and prompt action. So it's just super incredible to see where and how this combination of education, civic engagement, artistic production, scholarly research all come together to create these spaces and these conversations within a wide range of communities.
Yeah, it's exciting to see because there's so many of those things in your experiences are evident in your work. But I think one of the things that's so exciting to me to hear you speak, because I've heard you speak before, is that you approach it very much in the way of problem posing, which is an educational technique. And so I think that you have this ability to sort of fold those two areas of knowledge together so well, that makes your work so engaging. Like you said, there are multiple ways to enter the work and understand it and sit with it. And watch it grow and change as I appreciate it more and more each time I look at it. I find something new, which makes me really excited as an educator and as an artist, just to be around your work. This is from Victoria Castillo. I'd like to ask if you've noticed any patterns while doing your codex, and do the same events tend to repeat in the same general locations, or have you seen a lot of progress in a geographic location's history? Do you see patterns in the same general locations? Yeah.
Well, I mean, certainly, I think that there are patterns of violence and cycles of kind of trauma that you see cyclically along the border. There are a number of sites that are really potent, and it's an opportunity to recognize these things that are highly, highly disturbing, and then look back throughout time to understand how the hell did we get through it the last time? What are some of the ways in which we persist and can see hope and can organize ourselves and take care of one another, you know? So it's about really digging through a lot of different sources and texts to make sense of this present moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it is an amazing document of this present moment too, and all of the emotional and I think historic complexity of the time that we're living in, because it has been a devastating time, and it's so powerful to see all of the recording of that, and to think of the time that we're living through as a historical document that's living in your work is really exciting. This is from Jennifer Nguyen. Considering the heavy content in your work, have you experienced emotional difficulties while working on an artwork? If so, what was that like for you? How do you cope?
Oh boy. It is absolutely weighty. As I mentioned, with the last exhibition that was 20 objects in memory and honoring the stories of these 7 child migrants, it is and always is very, very, very taxing. So this field study that I do, these plant walks, these going through kind of the smelling, the handling, the preparing, the caring for, the research of the plants provides me strength. In that exhibition for You Will Not Be Forgotten, which was the last show, I also had to really understand that I'm not doing this work alone. This is work that I'm doing with the members of Project 1521, with organizers, with organizations that I know that are making a difference. In that last exhibition, I had an opportunity to invite the Young Center that trains volunteers to go with child migrants to court, those unaccompanied children, and invite them to the exhibition for the reading. When the entire gallery was in tears because of the poems that Diana Magaloni created for each child, that Adolfo Guzman Lopez, the education reporter poet, created for these children, we all had to take a minute. And there was a lot of power in that room. There was a lot of empathy in that room. And there was a lot of feeling that people didn't know what to do with. And at that moment, I invited my colleague, Lila, to share with everyone that they could sign up for these trainings to support unaccompanied minors, that they could support the organization with time or resources that they might have, but that we are not hopeless and that we are not powerless in these moments when the tax dollars that we pay are being used to abuse the most vulnerable within our communities.
That's such a powerful idea. I mean, I just, as you were speaking about it and then it moved through me, I just thank you for doing that. But how amazing to use art in that way to motivate people to become involved and not to sit on the sidelines and watch things passively. It's incredible. This question is from Thomas Cepeda. When did you feel it was your duty to create your own codex to illustrate the land's colonial effects in our present time using 16th century illustrations?
When I started really reading about the conquest, when I started really digging into Book 12 of the Florentine Codex, when I realized that there are only a handful of these codices created on amate. And amate, as I've mentioned before, is this sacred ceremonial, once outlawed paper. It is the external bark of a variety of trees. The paper maker who makes all of my paper is Efrain Danza in San Pablito in Puebla. And they use traditional fig bark, but they also incorporate mulberry, jonote, they include clay into it. But the codices prior to the conquest were collected and burned. Okay, our history was destroyed so that you could have this new time period, this new slate to really convert the survivors in the next generation. And so, if there are very rare and few visual narratives that teach about our cultural production history and moments that we need to continue to share, then it makes sense to create these works using the materials of the Americas in this way as an act of resistance.
Awesome. This question is from Oscar Leon. With such a controversial topic, illegal immigration, does your work receive backlash? And if so, how do you address it?
Not yet.
This is from Karina Lee. It was wonderful to learn about your process. I was wondering, in all of your years of traveling and researching, what is a piece of information that's left the biggest impact on you?
Well, that's a doozy. I don't know.
I know it's like a contest for all of the information. Well, especially because of the way your mind works. Like I have to say that, I told the students today, I was like, you're going to witness a genius talk today. And I said, and I don't use that word ever, and I was like, because your brain works in so many different ways on so many different levels at the same time that it's almost, it feels exciting to keep up with you. So I can imagine that, when you were describing finding the feather and then finding the fish and then the complexity of that one little line of investigation and how far it led you in your imagination, your mind really, it works like you're going down the rabbit hole. You go all the way through that one thought and see it to its end and then go, okay, I've recorded that. Now I'm ready to integrate that and fold that into my overall project, which I think is, it's just fascinating to me to listen to you talk about your work and then to see the evidence of all that thoughtfulness. So yeah, I can imagine it would be hard because it seems like a lot of things are competing for attention in your imagination, and somehow you balance all of them. It's incredible.
It's a challenge, and especially right now, trying to work on simultaneous exhibitions. When I typically focus on one is proving to be a challenge, but I'll tell you that the same way that we do work in education, of thinking about discrete programs and discrete curricular resources, you have an opportunity to just really organize your time and say, on this day, I'm working on these particular elements and those to-do lists, right?
Yeah.
And having a little bit of support also helps in terms of scholars that I'm in conversation with, institutional partners that I'm in conversation with, historians and researchers that I can use a little lifeline and text a question or drop a phone call or jump on a Zoom to get a more in-depth picture as I'm falling down these rabbit holes.
It's awesome. This is from Rob Wisman. Do you have a different affinity for the art you create with traditional papers and self-created paints?
Of course. And I'll tell you, in 2014, 2015, I had a residency, a 14-month residency with art and practice in Leimert Park. And at the time, I was still really working in oil on canvas and working in store-bought watercolor on 100% rag Arches paper, that 300-pound gorgeous paper. And I created 26 views of South LA at the moment when we knew South LA was being gentrified and revitalized and they're bringing through the train lines. It was at that moment when I had gone on a trip to Oaxaca with my family, procured the cochinilla in a powder form in a bookstore, came back to the studio, was super excited to make it into paint, painted a canvas, a primed white gessoed canvas with this red paint. And it glowed in this way that no cadmium, no alizarin, no modern colorant could glow. And it just sat there because I hadn't painted on a red support before. And it wasn't until I'm scrolling through my phone that I saw the story of the 43 Teachers College students that were murdered in Ayotzinapa, disappeared, and the protests that ensued. So now you're looking at, the marches and demonstrations and government buildings on fire, overturned vehicles. And that was the moment when I understood that I could move away from the Western European paints and supports and really use a material that supported the content in this really poetic and beautiful way to understand the relationship to materials and the associations with those materials. For materials like a red ochre, that is not only a material that is found, all over the world, but has been used in the history of painting since we started painting in caves. It's also used in ritual. It's also used in ceremony. These materials have power. And through the processing of these materials, there is nothing more soothing and exciting than the expected and unexpected outcomes of processing color yourself.
Awesome. This is from Nikki Barakat, and she's saying that this question is coming from her sister who is outside the art world. Do you have any general tips on incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion in teaching?
I'll tell you that that's a really loaded question and not off the top of my head.
Let's see. This is from Nicole Neal. With serious subject matters such as detention centers, it's easy to become saddened by humanity. How do you keep going?
Field study, talking with colleagues, again, just really having the opportunity to read primary sources, read the new scholarship, understand how people are re-examining narratives that we have accepted and been fed. And it's through community, it's through teaching, it's through conversations, it's through projects, it's through the meeting that I just jumped off of right before jumping onto this one, getting to work collaboratively with a cohort that is moving forward a conversation that allows for new conversations, that allows for new interpretations, that allows for new ways of seeing spaces, collections, subjects, audiences, so on and so forth. Yeah.
This question is from Rebecca Caldona. When creating artwork like maps in particular, have you ever collaborated with others, artists and non-artists, to help make your work more accurate? What was that process like, and have you ever faced any difficulties along the way?
In terms of accuracy in mapping, I don't feel whatsoever compelled to have a Google map, space, satellite, coastal kind of absolute detail. If we need that, we know where to look. It's online. When I'm creating my maps, for example, one of the maps that I'm working on for the Denver Art Museum show that's going to be traveling, it's about a 16th century indigenous woman who was the translator, Malinche, who's also, this important figure that had a huge part in kind of the negotiations between Cortez and the Aztec Empire, right? I'm using a 16th century map that has California as an island because it's a reference to what Europe understood of the Americas. In terms of collaboration, I have a studio assistant that I love working with who understands my techniques. We've taught together. She helps with a number of different preliminary sketches and ideas, and we kind of work through and talk through things. But to date, in terms of a larger collaborative, I'd say that the collaboration is between writers, scholars, and visual art.
Mhm.
Yeah.
This question is from Robert. When you're making paint pigments, has an ingredient ever become unavailable to you? And do you use substitutes? Are there substitutes for certain colors? Are there some paints that can't be made out of limited resources over time? I'm thinking of a paint like Mummy Brown.
Yeah. And I'll tell you that what is interesting when you look at this Florentine Codex, and as I mentioned, it was created amid a pandemic and a colonial regime. By the time they get to book 11, which is the book of natural history that has all of the animals, all of the birds, all of the insects, all of the plants, all of the ways in which painters have created color, it is now lockdown. It is a full blown pandemic outside. They cannot go procure more color. It becomes black and white.
Mm-hmm.
When the city shut down last March, instead of going for toilet paper, I ordered as much paper of amate as I could because I didn't know when I was going to be able to get it again. There are a number of prepared pigments that I use, including Maya Blue, which is indigo that is fused with a palygorskite clay, or there's other clays that they also use. I don't know how to heat indigo once processed with this clay at said temperature to produce this fluffy, beautiful historic paint that was first synthesized in the 3rd century. There was a distributor where I got 2 big jars of it in 2018, and I'm running low. There is a pigment distributor in New York where I ordered this pigment, and it has taken, like, it took 4 months to get this pigment. So, yeah, there are certain colors that you can't get your hands on, and no, you can't fake it. You put it next to every modern synthetic blue, and it is not the same blue, you know? And in order for it to reference that particular region, that particular story of that color, you just have to work around it.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the next question is: there's a paint that you haven't been able to recreate that's sort of been lost to you, almost like an endangered species. Have you lost any paints or the ability to make any of the colors?
No, but I'll tell you, with the first map, I was so strict about not using any of the tubes that I had. And I have French paints, Japanese paints, I've got like all my favorites. But to get a certain yellow or to get a certain orange, I was trying everything I possibly could to get certain plants to give up the color, and I couldn't. And you just have to be okay with it. I'll tell you that now I've really moved away from processing the plant based colors solely because it is fugitive. It does degrade. If I don't have the orchid gum that painters used 500 years ago to stabilize that plant based color, which I don't because it's too expensive, I'm going to go ahead and layer that fugitive color that will fade over time, and I will back it up with a modern colorant. So you know that it's infused with the power of that particular colorant, but that it has some backup for longevity and for archival purposes in collections.
Oh, I feel like I learned so much today from listening to you talk. I'm curious about your working with students at Caltech. How is it different to work with scientists as an audience, especially making paints and pigments, people who normally don't make art? What is that like?
So it was wonderful. I mean, the conversations that science engineering students have around the content that I'm introducing is different than the questions that I have. So the conversations are really different, and I really appreciate the questions and the curiosity that they bring. There is a number of experiments and results and cataloging that goes along with the preparation of color. And I found that the conversations were as dynamic and as deep as education students or art students or any of the other, but certainly the approach to the material is going to be slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much for talking to us today. I mean, I can't say enough thank you. And I know that the students feel very grateful and honored that you're here today. I'd like to open it up to anybody in the audience. I know we have some art historians in the audience. If anybody wants to ask a question, we have about 3 minutes left, so we can get one more question in. If anyone wants to have the final thought. This is the hardest part of teaching is the uncomfortable. Yeah, everyone's just saying thank you so much. Thank you so
It's a lot of content.
Yeah, it is. And thank you so much to the students for asking really in-depth questions and very thoughtful questions. I think that the chat has been such a wonderful element of Zoom that I've learned to use because I think everybody is a little camera shy at this point in the semester. Yeah, this is from Joanna Roche's Art History. Wonderful and so informative. Thank you so much, Sandy. They're all saying thank you and happy faces. It's very cute.
Well, it absolutely my pleasure, and thank you for the wonderful conversation and your thoughtful questions, and really a pleasure to be here with you today. And I hope to see you in the future at some
Yeah,
of the exhibitions and at future talks. And I'm wishing you all the very best as you're wrapping up week 13.
thank you so much. Have a
Thank you,
wonderful day.
Sandy. Just want to conclude. Does anyone else have a question?
I do. Hang on. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Hi. I'm Elisa Mandel. I teach pre-Columbian and Latin American art history. Loved your talk. It is so exciting for me to see how a contemporary artist uses her knowledge of art history and apply it to her work. And of course, you're working right in my area. So my question is, whether you in your recent work, which was the last exhibit I saw was your exhibit, and like days
So
later, everything shut down. Did you reach out to the family members, to the surviving family members, parents? Were you able to? Was that at all part of your work?
So that's a great question, Elisa. And I'll tell you that from the very beginning, after reading all of the news stories in English, in Spanish, from international press and domestic press, after seeing and hearing the testimony of some of the parents in court, I started with the studies. I started with these portraits, these small 5x7 portraits. In each of the news stories, you saw parents holding phones with the pictures of the kids. And what struck me was that these studies needed to go to these families for their Day of the Dead altars so that the families could have a portrait. I have attempted a number of times to contact legal counsel for these families because of the sensitivity of their privacy. I've not been able to get the objects to the families. I am working this year to figure out how do I do this, you know, but they're still in my possession and they are intended for the family members to have for their altars, and hopefully by this fall at least, I should be able to get them out. Last year was quite a challenge in between everything going on to try to reach out as a number of the families are spread out.
Right, right. But yeah, maybe I'd love to talk to you sometime about my research on angelitos, photographs of deceased children dressed in these costumes. It's a project that I found. I mean, they're beautiful images, but it's heartbreaking. And anyway, that's where this question was sort of coming from, my curiosity of how involved you were able to get with the families, and that must have been difficult as well to talk to them.
Yeah. But thank you.
Thank you. This was a great talk.
Awesome.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for that last question, Lisa. Having worked in museum education prior to my post here at Cal State Fullerton, I have so much admiration in what you do, your artistic investigations, and your approach to educational engagement. And if no one else has a question, that concludes our program. And we want to thank Sandy Rodriguez for generously spending time with us today. And Sandy, we look forward to seeing your upcoming projects in the near future. And for everyone out there, to get more insight on Sandy's work, be sure to visit her website at studiosandyrodriguez.com. And on behalf of the Begovich Gallery, Marianne Pomonis, and the Visual Arts Department, we want to thank you all for making this lecture series such a success and for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Sure. And if students have direct questions for me, feel free to email me at mail@Studio Sandy Rodriguez.
Perfect.
I think you're going to get a lot of questions.
You're going to get a lot, Sandy.
You can also email info@studiosandyrodriguez@gmail. That one's probably better. I'm away at a painting retreat until April 27th, but I will do my best to check out your questions and let you know. I know, Eder, you had a question. Did you want to just shoot?
Oh no, I'm just it wasn't really about the lecture. It's just I'm reporting this for the Daily Titan, and this was being recorded and stuff, and I would like to ask for permission if we could include some of your works in the story we're going to write.
Oh yeah, for sure. Just again, shoot an email to info@studiosandyrodriguez@gmail and let us know how many images you need and what size.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You got it. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Such a joy chatting with you.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.